"I think I hit him. I think I hit him with my car." 6 words that shattered the silence of a snow-covered morning in Canton, Massachusetts. 6 words that would divide a town, destroy careers, and launch one of the most controversial murder trials in recent history. In the quiet suburban town of Canton, Massachusetts, a cold winter night in January 2022 would forever change the lives of 2 families and divide an entire community. A police officer was dead, his girlfriend stood accused of his murder. But was it truly that simple? In a case marred by allegations of corruption, conflicting evidence, and small-town politics, the question remains, did Karen Reed deliberately kill her boyfriend, Officer John O'Keefe? Or was she the perfect scapegoat in a far more sinister plot? Tonight, on Cryptic Detective, we dive deep into one of the most controversial murder trials in recent Massachusetts history, a case where nothing is as it seems, and where the search for truth reveals something far more terrifying than a crime of passion, the possibility that justice itself might be for sale. Karen Reed, a 42-year-old finance professor and equity analyst, had been dating Boston police officer John O'Keefe for 2 years. By all accounts, their relationship seemed loving and stable. Friends described them as happy together, with no signs of serious problems or violence. O'Keefe, 46, was not just a police officer but also the guardian of his niece and nephew after his sister and her husband died. Those who knew him described a dedicated uncle who had stepped up to provide stability for these children after unimaginable loss. Why would a successful finance professor with no history of violence suddenly murder a man who had become her partner in building a future? And why would a decorated police officer, trained to detect danger, never see it coming? What drives someone to kill the person they supposedly love? Was there something darker beneath the surface of this seemingly normal relationship? Or was Karen Reed telling the truth when she insisted she never meant to harm O'Keefe? Think about this for a moment. How well do we really know the people we share our lives with? The person who sleeps beside you every night could be harboring secrets you couldn't begin to imagine. January 28, 2022, a Friday evening that began like many others for the couple. The air was frigid, temperatures dropping below freezing as heavy snow began to fall across eastern Massachusetts. Inside C.F. McCarthy's bar, the contrast couldn't have been starker. Warm bodies pressed together, the smell of beer and whiskey hanging in the air, laughter punctuating the din of dozens of conversations. Karen and John had been bar hopping in the Canton area, visiting C.F. McCarthy's and then moving on to Waterfall Bar and Grill. According to multiple witnesses, both had been drinking throughout the evening. What happened next would become the center of one of the most contentious trials Massachusetts had seen in years. The prosecution and defense presented drastically different versions of what occurred after they left the waterfall around midnight. According to the prosecution, Karen Reed drove John to a gathering at the home of Brian Albert, another Boston police officer on Fairview Road. They alleged that after an argument, Reed dropped O'Keefe off, made a 3-point turn, and struck him with her SUV, leaving him to die in the snowstorm that raged that night. But Reed's defense painted a completely different picture. They claimed that after dropping O'Keefe off, Reed went home, unaware that anything had happened to him. It wasn't until the next morning, concerned that he wasn't answering her calls, that she returned to look for him, ultimately discovering his body in the snow. Why did phone records show that someone at the Albert residence called the Canton Police Department's direct line, not 911, at 12:45 a.m., hours before O'Keefe's body was officially discovered? And why was this call mysteriously missing from the official investigation report? A former state police detective, speaking to us on condition of anonymity, revealed something troubling. The initial investigation focused exclusively on Reed from the first hour. Standard procedure is to explore all possible scenarios, but that never happened here. It was as if the conclusion had been written before the investigation even began. What truly happened in those dark hours, and why were there so many conflicting accounts from witnesses at the scene? But the most disturbing question may be this: was John O'Keefe already dead before Karen Reed ever left the scene that night? 6:07 in the morning. The cold bit through clothing like knives. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, accumulating on hair and eyelashes within seconds. The temperature had plummeted to 15 degrees Fahrenheit by early morning, with visibility reduced to mere feet. Karen Reed, along with 2 friends, returned to Fairview Road around 6 a.m., worried about O'Keefe's whereabouts. The snow had continued falling all night, blanketing the neighborhood in over 8 inches of pristine white, except for one disturbing anomaly: a single set of footprints leading from the Albert home into the yard and then back again. They found his body in the snow outside the Albert home. He was barely clinging to life, suffering from head trauma, hypothermia, and severe injuries. Despite being rushed to the hospital, JohnOkeefe was pronounced dead. But here is where the case takes its first strange turn. According to Reed's defense, when the women called 911, the Canton Police Department's response was shockingly swift. Officers arrived within minutes, almost as if they had been waiting nearby. Why would police respond so quickly on a snowy morning to what should have been a routine wellness check? And even more disturbing, why did some officers appear to immediately focus on Reed as a suspect before any investigation had properly begun? How did the first responding officer know to approach Karen Reed directly, bypassing the other women present, and ask if she was John's girlfriend before anyone had mentioned John's name to him? Court documents we've obtained reveal something the jury never heard. A neighbor's security camera caught a Canton police cruiser driving slowly past the Albert residence at 4:35 a.m., nearly 2 hours before Red and her friends discovered O'Keefe's body. The footage was never entered into evidence. The forensic evidence in this case raises more questions than it answers. The prosecution built their case on 3 key elements: damage to Reed's vehicle, O'Keefe's injuries, and Reed's alleged statements at the scene. Karen's black Lexus SUV had a cracked right taillight which prosecutors claimed was damaged when she struck O'Keefe. They pointed to a cocktail glass found in her vehicle and her blood alcohol level, which was above the legal limit when tested hours after the incident. Perhaps most damning were the statements attributed to Reed by witnesses. According to first responders, she repeatedly said things like, "I hit him," and "I killed him," seeming to confess to the crime in the shock of the moment. But was this the reaction of a guilty woman, or the panicked response of someone who feared she might have accidentally contributed to her boyfriend's death by leaving him at the party? The defense pointed to crucial inconsistencies in the state's theory. The medical examiner found that O'Keefe had scratches on his arm that appeared to come from a dog, yet the Elbers claimed their dog was locked away that night. O'Keefe's injuries included a cut above his eye and bruising that didn't seem consistent with being struck by a vehicle. Most significantly, the defense presented evidence suggesting that O'Keefe's injuries occurred inside the Albert home rather than on the street. They highlighted testimony from forensic experts who questioned whether the damage to Reed's vehicle could have caused O'Keefe's specific injuries. Ask yourself, if you truly believed you had struck someone with your car, would you return to the scene hours later with witnesses? Would you call 90211 yourself? Or would you flee, destroy evidence, create an alibi? Why did investigators fail to collect and test the broken glass found near O'Keefe's body? Glass that didn't match Reed's tail light but did match a unique cocktail glass used exclusively at the Albert home? A former crime scene technician who reviewed the case files told us, "The selective collection of evidence in this case is unlike anything I've seen in my 22-year career. It's as if they were building a specific narrative rather than following the evidence." What if JohnOkeefe never actually made it inside the house that night? What if something happened at that gathering that no one wanted to talk about? And why were certain witnesses changing their stories as the investigation progressed? The taillight wasn't the only thing broken that night. So was the chain of custody for critical evidence that might have told a very different story. The investigation itself would become as controversial as the crime. Defense attorneys Alan Jackson and David Yannetti aggressively pursued the theory that the investigation was deliberately biased against Reed from the start. They pointed to troubling connections. Brian Albert, the homeowner, was not only a Boston police officer, but came from a family with deep ties to local law enforcement. His father was a retired officer, and his brother worked for the Massachusetts State Police. The defense alleged that investigators failed to properly search the Albert home, declined to collect potential evidence, and ignored witnesses whose accounts didn't fit their theory that Red was the killer. But perhaps most shocking were the allegations that evidence had been manipulated or destroyed. The defense claimed that snow from the Albert property, snow that might have contained crucial evidence, was deliberately removed before crime scene technicians could examine it. How do you explain that by 8:30 IML, less than 2 hours after O'Keefe's body was found, a professional snow removal service was already clearing the Albert property, including the exact area where O'Keefe had been lying? A Canton Police Department insider who requested anonymity due to fear of retaliation provided us with texts showing that the instruction to clean up before CSI gets there came from someone within the department itself. These texts were never introduced at trial, as the judge ruled them inadmissible due to chain of custody concerns. If true, these allegations paint a disturbing picture. Was this simply a rushed investigation focused on an easy suspect, or was it something more sinister, a deliberate cover-up to protect one of their own? What happened in the moments before JohnOkeefe walked up that driveway may never be known, But what happened afterward bears all the hallmarks of something far more orchestrated than a standard homicide investigation. On February 1, 2022, just days after O'Keefe's death, Karen Redd was charged with manslaughter, leaving the scene of a fatal collision, and motor vehicle homicide while intoxicated. As the investigation continued, prosecutors upgraded the charges to second-degree murder, suggesting that Reed's actions showed extreme atrocity or cruelty, a necessary element for murder charges in Massachusetts. The prosecution's theory evolved over time. Initially, they suggested Reed might have struck O'Keefe accidentally while intoxicated. Later, they alleged that she had deliberately backed her SUV into him after an argument, leaving him to die in the snowstorm. But the defense maintained that Reed was being framed, set up to take the fall for something that happened inside the Albert home that night. They pointed to text messages showing that Reed was genuinely concerned about O'Keefe's whereabouts and had no idea he was in danger. Why did prosecutors dramatically change their theory of the case 3 separate times over the course of the investigation? And why did each new theory conveniently address the factual holes that defense attorneys had poked in the previous version? Think about this carefully. If you were going to commit murder, would you do it directly outside a house full of police officers, with witnesses who knew you were there, in your own easily identifiable vehicle? Or does this scenario make more sense as a hastily constructed frame job? Court documents we've obtained reveal a disturbing detail. The lead detective assigned to the case had previously been disciplined for evidence tampering in another case involving a fellow officer. This information was sealed by the court and never revealed to the jury. What could explain such radically different interpretations of the same evidence, and why did the prosecution's theory shift so significantly as the case progressed? When the snow melted away, what remained wasn't clarity, it was a web of contradictions that pointed to something far more complex than a drunk driving incident. As the case moved toward trial, the town of Canton found itself deeply divided. The blue line of police solidarity stood firmly behind the official narrative, while others in the community began to question whether Karen Redd was being railroaded. The tension was palpable. You could feel it in the grocery store checkout lines, at school pickup zones, even in church pews on Sunday mornings. Neighbors who had known each other for decades stopped speaking. Friendships dissolved over disagreements about Reed's guilt or innocence. Free Karen Reed signs appeared in yards throughout Norfolk County. Social media groups formed, with amateur sleuths poring over every detail of the case. Some residents reported feeling pressure to support one side or the other, with friendships and family relationships strained by disagreements over Reed's guilt or innocence. The case even attracted national attention, with true crime enthusiasts debating the evidence and theories online. What was it about this case that touched such a nerve? Was it the involvement of law enforcement on both sides, the allegations of corruption, or the simple fact that the truth seemed so elusive? How could a small-town police department with just 44 officers maintain objectivity when investigating one of their own, especially when the prime suspect was accusing them of a cover-up? A retired judge who lives in Canton told us confidentially, "This case exposed fault lines in our community that have existed for generations. Who gets protected, who gets prosecuted, and who gets to decide the difference? It's not just about Karen Reed anymore, it's about whether our justice system is fundamentally broken." Whatever the reason, by the time the trial began in April 2024, the Karen Reed case had become about much more than one woman's guilt or innocence. It had become a referendum on trust in local institutions and the question of whether justice could truly be blind when police investigate their own. The answers would prove even more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The trial of Karen Reed began on April 16, 2024, more than 2 years after JohnOkeefe's death. From the opening statements, it was clear this would be no ordinary murder trial. Prosecutor Adam Lally presented Reed as a jealous, intoxicated woman who had deliberately struck O'Keefe with her vehicle after an argument, then left him to die in freezing temperatures. The evidence will show that the defendant's actions that night, driving drunk, hitting John with her car, and leaving him there to die, caused his death, Lally told the jury. Defense attorney Alan Jackson painted a completely different picture, describing a perfect storm of corruption and cover-up. He boldly claimed that O'Keefe had actually been beaten inside the Albert home and that law enforcement had conspired to frame Reed for his death. The courtroom itself became a battlefield, the air thick with tension, the wooden benches creaking under the weight of spectators who arrived hours early to secure seats. On one side sat O'Keefe's family and fellow officers, their faces set in grim determination. On the other, Reed's supporters, many wearing small blue ribbons, symbolizing their belief in her innocence. The trial lasted nearly 2 months, with testimony from dozens of witnesses, including first responders, partygoers, forensic experts, and investigators. Each day brought new revelations. Some of the most dramatic testimony came from witnesses who described Reed's behavior when O'Keefe's body was discovered. Jennifer McCabe, who had been with Reed that morning, testified that Reed had been hysterical, repeatedly saying, "I hit him and I killed him." The prosecution presented these statements as confessions, but the defense countered with evidence suggesting these statements referred to Reed's fear that by dropping O'Keefe off at the party, she had indirectly caused his death, not that she had physically struck him with her vehicle. Why did the witness who claimed to hear Reed's confession delete all her text messages from that night and the following morning, just hours after speaking with police? And why did police never attempt to recover those messages? As the trial progressed, troubling inconsistencies in the investigation emerged. Defense attorneys highlighted how certain witnesses had changed their statements over time, always in ways that strengthened the case against Reed. They questioned why potential evidence from inside the Albert home hadn't been collected, and why certain witnesses weren't interviewed until months after the incident. A juror who spoke to us after the trial concluded shared this observation. There was this moment during cross-examination when the lead detective couldn't explain why he hadn't collected key evidence. His face went completely blank. That's when many of us realized something was seriously wrong with this investigation. Perhaps most compelling was the testimony regarding O'Keefe's injuries. The defense's medical experts testified that the pattern of injuries was not consistent with being struck by a vehicle. They pointed to wounds that suggested a physical altercation, including defensive wounds on his arms. The question hanging over the courtroom was clear. If Karen Reed didn't kill John O'Keefe, who did? And why would so many people lie to protect the real killer? What the prosecution never expected was that their own evidence would ultimately unravel their case, piece by carefully constructed piece. After nearly 2 months of testimony and 4 days of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict on June 5, 2024. The courtroom fell silent as Karen Reed stood, facing the jury that would determine her fate. The air in the courtroom seemed to solidify. You could hear the shallow breathing of spectators, the slight rustle of the court officer's uniform as he stood at attention. Karen Reed's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the defense table, her knuckles white with tension. The verdict, not guilty on all counts. Gasps and sobs filled the courtroom. Supporters of Reed embraced each other while others sat in stunned silence. The verdict wasn't just a declaration of Reed's innocence, it was an implicit rejection of the investigation that had led to her charges. In a brief statement following the verdict, Reed expressed gratitude to her attorneys and supporters, but emphasized that there was no victory when John's killer remains free. She pledged to continue seeking justice for O'Keefe. Norfolk County District Attorney Michael Morrissey issued a statement respecting the jury's decision while defending the work of his prosecutors. "We presented the evidence we had, and the jury has spoken. We accept their verdict. If Karen Reed didn't kill John O'Keefe, then someone else did. And that person, potentially a police officer, has been walking free for over 2 years. How many people know the truth? And what lengths would they go to protect that secret?" An anonymous member of the jury later told us, "What convinced us wasn't just the evidence that was presented, it was the evidence that should have been there but wasn't. The investigation had so many holes it felt deliberate. We couldn't escape the feeling that we were seeing only what certain people wanted us to see." But for many observers, the questions don't end with the verdict. If Karen Reed didn't kill John O'Keefe, then who did? And will they ever be brought to justice? The answer may be closer than anyone realizes, hiding in plain sight among those sworn to protect and serve. In the months following the verdict, the ripple effects of the Karen Reed case continued to spread through Massachusetts law enforcement and judicial circles. And the Massachusetts Attorney General's office announced an investigation into the handling of the case, focusing specifically on allegations that evidence was mishandled or deliberately suppressed. Several officers involved in the initial investigation were placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome. Reed filed a civil lawsuit against the Canton Police Department, the Massachusetts State Police, and several individual officers, alleging violation of her civil rights and malicious prosecution. The lawsuit, seeking millions in damages, cited specific instances where investigators allegedly ignored exculpatory evidence. Meanwhile, O'Keefe's family remained divided. Some accepted the jury's verdict and joined calls for a renewed investigation into his death. Others maintained their belief in Reed's guilt, suggesting the jury had been swayed by an aggressive defense and media coverage sympathetic to Reed. Why did 3 officers from the original investigation suddenly take early retirement within weeks of the verdict? And what was in the internal affairs report that the department has fought so aggressively to keep sealed? A law enforcement source with direct knowledge of the investigation told us there are officers who know exactly what happened that night, who have been living with this secret for years now. The pressure is building. Someone will eventually break. The case has prompted calls for reform in how investigations involving law enforcement are handled in Massachusetts. Legislators proposed bills requiring independent oversight when police officers are victims or witnesses in serious crimes, aiming to prevent the conflicts of interest that may have tainted the Red investigation. Ask yourself this. In a system where those investigating crimes are closely connected to those involved in them, can justice ever truly be impartial? Or are we simply trusting the fox to investigate missing hens? What began as a tragic death has evolved into something far more sinister, a test case for whether our institutions of justice can police themselves. And the early results are not encouraging. As we conclude our examination of this extraordinary case, many questions remain unanswered. What actually happened to John O'Keefe that night? If he wasn't struck by Karen Reed's vehicle, how did he sustain his fatal injuries? Who was present at the Albert home when O'Keefe arrived, and what transpired there? Why did some witnesses change their stories as the investigation progressed? Was there truly a conspiracy to frame Karen Reed, and if so, how far up did it reach in law enforcement? Will anyone ever be held accountable for O'Keefe's death? The most disturbing question of all, how many other cases have been manipulated in similar ways, with victims and perpetrators chosen based not on evidence, but on who needed to be protected? A source close to the new investigation has confirmed to us that authorities are now examining cell tower data that places several previously cleared individuals at the scene during critical hours, individuals who testified under oath that they were elsewhere that night. The Karen Reed case reminds us that the search for justice is rarely straightforward. It shows us how quickly assumptions can become facts, how easily investigations can be compromised, and how difficult it can be to uncover the truth once a narrative has been established. For the residents of Canton, Massachusetts, the case has left an indelible mark. Trust in local institutions has been shaken, and the community remains divided. Some say it will take a generation to heal the wounds opened by this case. And somewhere, perhaps the person who actually caused John O'Keefe's death remains free, watching, waiting, and wondering if justice will ever catch up to them. This has been Cryptic Detective. Join us next time as we explore another case where the line between truth and fiction blurs and where justice hangs in the balance. Remember to subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories that challenge your perceptions and reveal the complex human dramas behind the headlines. Until next time, keep questioning. Sometimes the most obvious answer is the one most carefully constructed to deceive.